So I mentioned that today we were thinking about covenant, which is basically just a fancy word for promises. So I wanted to ask you about promises that you might have made. We make lots of promises, don't we, all the time. Sometimes it's day to day, playing nicely with your siblings, maybe. Tidying your room. Maybe you promise to do your homework before the week starts. What sort of promises do you make? What was the last promise that you made, do you think? Anybody? No. Well, I happen to have a sneaky insight that some people here who might have been members of or leaders of the Girl Guiding movement might have made their promise relatively recently as part of the Thinking Day celebrations that you had. And I wondered whether any of you that are here who have been part of Girl Guiding would like to stand up and maybe demonstrate your promise to the rest of the congregation. It's okay to make the promise that you remember. I know that it's changed a lot recently, and even Harriet, who's not been in Brownies that long, is still getting her head round the King-Queen change. And I know there's been lots of other changes as well. But if you'd like to show us the promise that you made when you were part of Girl Guiding, it would be really nice to hear that. You don't have to come to the front, but anybody who would be willing to stand up where you are. Yeah, that's all right. Don't put people on the spot. That's not fair. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
I promise to do my best to be true to myself and develop my pace, to help other people, to help other people and to keep the Brownie Guide going.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Please all sit down. That was. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really nice to see that there's so many different ways that has changed over the time that everybody was involved in Guides and Brownies. And that shows that actually we all make lots of different promises, and we have to think about who we're promising to, and that has changed as we've changed the different focus of the work. So one of the things I was thinking about was that there's a reading we're going to hear later when the young people have left us, which is about a promise that God made to two people called Abraham and Sarah. And God made a promise to them. They were very old, but God made a promise to them that they would have lots and lots of children. Yes, I'm Sarah too, thank you. And God made a promise to them that they would have lots and lots of children and that they would be the ancestors of kings. And God also promised that God would be their God forever and ever and would always be with them. And one of the signs of that promise in the reading that we heard was that God changed their names. They were Abram and Sarai, and when God made that promise to them, they had a different name. And I think a lot of the promises that we make have some kind of outward symbol that we have to recognize that. You might have your promise badge from Brownies and Guides. I wear a wedding ring, which symbolizes the promises that Chris and I made to each other when we got married. Do you think that there's any symbols that we might know of, or signs of promises that God makes to us? Oh, hand up. Harriet. A rainbow. Well done, 10 out of 10. The rainbow was a symbol of the promise that God made never to flood the earth again. Sorry, I'm a little distracted here. But the important thing about the promise that God made to Abraham and Sarah was that, and the promises that God makes to us, is that they didn't have to do anything to earn that promise. They didn't have to do a certain thing for God to promise that to them. God promised to always be with them and promises to always be with us. And we don't have to do anything to be loved by God.
A reading from Genesis, chapter 17. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the Almighty God. Obey me and always do what is right. I will make my covenant with you and give you many descendants. Abraham bowed down his face touching the ground, and God said, I make this covenant with you. I promise that you will be the ancestor of many nations. Your name will no longer be Abraham, but Abraham, because I am making you the ancestor of many nations. I will give you many descendants, and some of them will be kings. You will have so many descendants that they will become nations. I will keep my promise to you and to your descendants in future generations, and an everlasting covenant. I will be your God and the God of your descendants. God said to Abraham, you must no longer call your wife Sarai. From now on, her name is Sarah. I will bless her, and I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will become the mother of nations, and there will be kings among her descendants. Here endeth this morning's reading.
Next reading is Mark 8, verses 31 to 38. Jesus speaks about his suffering and death. Then Jesus began to teach his disciples, the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law. He will be put to death, but 3 days later he will rise to life. He made this very clear to them. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus turned round, looked at his disciples and rebuked Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. Your thoughts don't come from God, but from man. Then Jesus called the crowd and his disciples to him. If anyone wants to come with me, he told them, he must forget self, carry his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his own life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and of the gospel will save it. Does a person gain anything if he wins the whole world but loses his life? Of course not. There is nothing he can give to regain his life. If a person is ashamed of me and of my teaching in this godless and wicked day, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of him, and when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Amen.
So I said that's often a hymn that we use in the Methodist Covenant service, and that's why I chose it today, because the covenant with God is one of the themes linking the two readings we heard. In the first reading, we have God making a covenant with Abraham and Sarah, promising them many descendants. In the Gospel reading, Jesus talks about the call to discipleship and how those who follow him need to respond. And that's a bit like the other half of the covenant, the commitment that we make to God. At the start of the year, we all, as a church and individuals, rededicate ourselves to God in that covenant service. And we say, I am no longer my own, but yours. Your will, not mine, be done in all things. And I want to think a bit about these promises today as we think about that covenant relationship. The reading from Genesis tells us about the covenant that God made with Abraham. God tells Abraham that he will have many descendants. He will be the father of many nations and kings. And the covenant that God makes will be everlasting, and it extends to all of Abraham's descendants forever. God then makes a promise to Abraham and Sarah that they will have a son, the heir promised them by God so many years before. But the interesting thing about these promises is that it's God that makes them. The responsibility for that relationship rests with God. It's God who will give them their many descendants, and God will bless Sarah with a son. God asks one thing of Abraham and Sarah and to all the people of that covenant: to walk before me faithfully and be blameless. But it's not a reward for their good behavior. It's a generous example of God's love. In the second reading, the covenant looks a little different. This is a covenant that comes about by Jesus becoming man, God present with people, and calling them to follow him. Jesus says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. Here's Jesus again turning the natural way of things on their head, and with it people's expectations. This reading also gives us a bit of a glimpse as to what God expects of us. Compared to the story of Abraham and Sarah, where God does all the work, Jesus' words make it clear that we have to act. The story of Abraham and Sarah is an outpouring of God's grace and love. while the gospel passage challenges us to think about how we should respond. When we bring the two together, we can see Jesus is calling us into a new covenant relationship with God. Jesus tells us what we need to do to be his followers. But do we really know what that means? In my translation, it goes like this: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." So let's think about those three different bits in turn. The first part, deny themselves, or in the version that Sally read, forget self. And in some ways that is the most challenging one, because it's not that clear what it means. As I said, sometimes it's deny, sometimes it says forget self. In other translations it's written as renounce self. And denial makes us think of self-denial and giving things up, particularly when we're in Lent. But Jesus isn't telling us to give away all our possessions, or at least not in this case. But he's also not just talking about giving up chocolate for a few weeks. Does that idea of denying yourself or renouncing self mean that we are to put ourselves down, to believe that we're not worthy? That doesn't sound right either. I think each of these ideas gives only a kind of partial idea of what this really means, but if we look at them together, we get a better picture of what Jesus is talking about. It's about our own self-interest and personal desires being less important. Jesus says that to be his followers, we have to set aside our claim on our lives and give them over to him. Isn't this what we pray in the covenant prayer each year? I am no longer my own, but yours. The same message comes up further on in the passage. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. Jesus isn't just talking about life itself, but something less tangible, a person's soul, the thing that makes them human. We're asked to put aside the very essence of ourselves to follow Jesus, and will become more fully like ourselves in the end if we do. But what does that mean today for us? Well, as we journey through Lent, we might be putting aside thinking about ourselves and our own material interests and trying to spend more time in prayer or reflecting on God's word. Perhaps we might be giving of our time or money in service of others. Today, we're in the middle of Fair Trade Fortnight. Perhaps that's a timely reminder of many people in the world who still don't get a fair wage for their work. And now, fair trade isn't really a new concept. It's something that maybe we take for granted. I read, when I was preparing for this service, that the idea of fair trade is now so common that most of the supermarkets are now stocking fair trade products as part of their budget ranges, because many shoppers now expect ethically produced goods as standard, even when facing the pressures of rising food prices. So the fair trade movement has achieved an awful lot, but there's still many people who still don't get a fair wage for their work, so there's still more to do. And Fair Trade Fortnight this year focuses on climate justice, that the supply of many goods we take for granted is at risk from climate change. It could soon be much more difficult to get things like coffee, chocolate, and bananas, as climate change makes crops like this a lot harder to grow. And while the Earth's changing climate is going to affect all of us, it will have the biggest impact on the poorer countries. Jesus said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And what does self-denial mean in the face of these issues? It's about continuing to champion fair trade goods and making intentional choices about what we buy from where. Maybe it's about taking the less convenient option when it comes to food shopping, travel, clothing, to make ethical and sustainable choices that demonstrate our care for creation in everything we do. And that connection between fair trade and climate is important, because as well as our eco-church commitments here, maybe we could think about becoming a fair trade church. It might be a bit less convenient because we'd have to think about where we buy our tea and coffee and biscuits from. But isn't that exactly what we're being called to do? The next part of Jesus' message is to take up our cross. Now, Jesus' death and resurrection is the centre of our faith, and the New Testament hinges on the Easter story. Without that, we wouldn't be sitting here today. The imagery of the cross and what it symbolises is everywhere. It's in our churches, but also in our hymns, in our prayers, and in our language. In some ways, we've become almost comfortable with it. When we hear Jesus saying, "Take up your cross," we think about the way we see the cross now. It's really difficult to think about what it would have meant for those listening at the time. Crucifixion was a really cruel form of torture, and it wasn't just punishment, but it was also used as a deterrent. The crosses would remain on display so that people could see what happens if you step out of line. For those listening to Jesus, it was a really real part of life. We can only imagine what they might have thought when asked to take up their cross and follow. And the point Jesus was making about the shame and disgrace that would come from following him was very real to those listening. I wonder if we feel the same today. As usual, it's Peter who says what everyone else is thinking. When Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer many things, he's thinking, no, this can't be right. Peter believes Jesus is the Messiah, but how can the Messiah be the one who's rejected and killed? How could God's promise be fulfilled through all that suffering? But Peter, perhaps like us, is looking for a very different Messiah. And he gets really angry when Jesus won't be the Messiah he wants him to be. Jesus tells him he's thinking about earthly things, not divine things. Isn't this true of all of us, maybe at times? I think I find it quite easy to empathise with Peter right now. It would be easier not to have to think about all this suffering. The idea of having to pick up our own cross makes us uncomfortable. It's easier to think that maybe the hard work's already been done for us. If we're not careful, we get drawn into that idea that Jesus' suffering somehow lets us off the hook, that he's paid the price, and we just have to accept it. But maybe that's a bit like Peter, and Jesus wasn't going to let him get away with the easy option any more than he would us. And all too often, the church is unwilling to take up the cross for the same reason. The challenging questions that might put us in a difficult situation or force us to stand up for what we believe. Have we maybe learnt these days to not say anything too controversial, anything that might attract too much attention? But Jesus says this is exactly what we should be doing. And what does that mean for us today? It was interesting to see the reaction to Kate Forbes, the SNP leadership candidate recently, who got a lot of media attention for her conservative views about equal marriage, transgender rights, and other things. Leaving aside that I disagree with her position, she's been completely honest and upfront about her faith and what it means for her, despite obvious potential damage to her career prospects. And she's taken significant criticism for that. Whether you agree with her or not, I wonder if we would have the same courage and strength of conviction to stand up for our faith. Back to fair trade and climate justice. Shouldn't the church be the one standing up for the countries affected, demanding perhaps that wealthier countries like the UK commit to funding climate action in poorer countries to help them adapt? Perhaps just like the increased demand for fair trade products, if there's more voices demanding action, then something will need to change. And I think the church should be one of those voices out there demanding change. To voluntarily pick up the cross and follow means to stand up for issues we believe in, whatever the consequences for ourselves. Again, here there are echoes of that covenant prayer. Your will be done when I am valued and when I am disregarded. Jesus' message is that we're not supposed to be sticking to the easy route, but speaking out and standing up for the needs of the vulnerable, even if that makes us unpopular. For this is the way of the cross. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of the resistance movement against Nazism in the Second World War, and he described taking the easy way out as cheap grace, or grace without cost. With cheap grace, there's no chance of being held to account and no cross to carry. As a church, the cheap grace option is to put the stability of our church community ahead of the real problems of the community outside our walls. The opposite of cheap grace is costly grace. And Bonhoeffer describes it like this. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It's the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And that brings us to the final part of Jesus' call, which simply asks us to follow him. Jesus says that to be a disciple, we must follow where he leads, wherever that is. And the things that come before that we must deny ourselves and take up our cross, tell us that we're not being asked to follow only when it's easy or when it takes us somewhere that we're happy to go, but always, even if it's away from our home or out of our comfort zone, and even if the route ends in suffering and rejection. Jesus called his disciples simply by saying, "Follow me." They didn't know where he was leading them or what it would mean, but they went anyway. Now, when he starts to tell them a bit about what it means, some of them are understandably a little unhappy. That's not quite what we expected. And I think that's generally true for us too. Even though we now know a lot more about Jesus' life and what happened next, we still struggle with the idea of agreeing to follow no matter what. And I don't know about you, but for me, partly that's because I don't necessarily know what following Jesus is going to mean for me in the coming days, months, and years. I struggle with it because it's unknown. And that also means I don't really have any answers to this bit. There's no formula because the ways we're called to follow are as many and different as us. And they might not always be the obvious things. We often think of a calling as being about preaching and evangelism, but surely there's lots of ways to demonstrate God's love for those we meet, whether that's serving tea and coffee, arranging flowers, or making sure we communicate our events to those who need to know. It might not be the sole purpose of this sermon, but this feels like an appropriate point to do another little plug for the stewardship exercise that's underway at the moment. Maybe you could think today about what you are being called to do as part of following Jesus. From today's readings, the challenge for each of us is to work out what following Jesus means for us, to discern what our place is in the covenant that God has made with God's people. The covenant which God made with Abraham and Sarah was a promise that God would walk with them always. In Jesus, we are called to fulfill our part of this covenant, to act on the promises we've made, to pick up our cross and follow. In our covenant prayer, we state our commitment to God to set aside our own desires and wishes and accept God's will for our lives, whatever that might be. Jesus' call to follow him is the expression of that commitment, the means by which we act on those promises. The covenant of Abraham and Sarah, which we are part of, calls us not just to a verbal agreement, but challenges to take action. Following Jesus will be costly. Life will be turned on its head. But once we've heard his call, we can't continue as we were.